Max Verstappen has managed to hold off a hard-charging Lando Norris in the final laps of the Imola Grand Prix and left us with a grandstand finish after I thought Max had this race under control. So let's dive into it, and what an interesting end to the race it truly was. Of course, we first have to start with talking about the finish of the race, and this race was definitely a slow burner. Verstappen held the lead into turn 1 and had the race basically under control until around 15 laps remaining, when he suddenly had a nosedive in pace and Norris began to reel him in. Norris originally was able to take 0.8 of a second chunks out of his lead, but as he got closer to Verstappen, Verstappen was able to pick up his pace a bit and only slowed down to being a tenth or two per lap. Norris was 1.5 seconds back for around the final 4 laps and was closing in on the final lap and just missed DRS onto the run onto the final lap by 0.5 of a second at the detection point. He was never going to be able to pass Verstappen in any spot apart from down the main straight, so it was basically over from that point, and he got to within 0.7 of a second across the line. Norris thought that with another 2 laps he might have been able to catch and pass Verstappen, but again, I'm not so sure. Verstappen was managing his race and battery, knowing that he only had to defend for 5 more laps. So I think if he had known there were 10 more laps to go, he would have played with his battery and his defensive tactics a bit more differently. But at this stage, you never know. Norris may have been able to pass him in the end with more laps, but he may not have. It's all academic at this point. And it's worth noting that Verstappen's nosedive in pace was to an interesting fact that they hadn't got the setup on the Red Bull completely right. On Saturday, they completely changed their setup from free practice on FP1 and FP2, and they hadn't got an opportunity to run this setup in race pace. So it just completely grained up the front tyres. There was basically no more tread left when it got to the end of the stint on the hards, hence his pace dropped drastically in comparison to Norris's. But what was interesting for me though is the Red Bull looked the superior car on the medium tyre, but as soon as it switched to the hard tyre, it seemed to struggle a lot more. So maybe that's just to do with their setup and how they work the softer and harder compounds of tyres. What's clear is that Red Bull are being caught by the chasing pack, however, as according to Formula Data Analysis on Twitter and Instagram, I'd recommend going to check him out. Norris, Verstappen and Leclerc all had average lap times within 0.1 of each other, which is incredibly close and not what we thought would be happening at the beginning of the season. I know Norris will be disappointed he couldn't make it 2 wins in a row, but it's still a very stellar effort from him to collect second place and put Verstappen under that much pressure. I'm starting to be more optimistic about the season going forward and that we might get more challenges for the win. If we didn't have that finish at the end of the race, this clearly would have been hands down the worst race so far this year. I don't really want to see F1 going to Imola in the future, as I just don't think it provides a good Grand Prix whatsoever. The first issue here is that it's basically impossible to overtake. There's only one DRS zone down the main straight, which is decently long, but has terrible corners for overtaking on either end of it. The Sambarello chicane is a 5th gear slalom. The braking zone is so short because the cars carry so much downforce, meaning there really isn't an opportunity to outbrake someone into turn 1 here. You basically have to be alongside them once you get to the braking zone. There's no chance to outbrake them, as dive bombs are discouraged because of that slight kink and just because how fast it's taken. So it just really discourages hard, good racing just because of how fast the corner's taken. So maybe a circuit modification they can make is to increase the radius of the corners, slowing it down. You then have the corner that leads onto the main straight, which is Ravazza 2, which is just aero wash city with these current gen cars and also the previous generation cars. It's a 5th gear medium speed corner that is single file. You can't take any alternate lines through here to get your front nose out of the dirty air of the car ahead. And cars would consistently lose 2 temps following other cars through this corner, making it impossible to stay close enough to use the DRS to make an overtake into turn 1. You also have the issue of the pit lane here, which is an interesting one. It's actually the longest pit lane delta on the F1 calendar, meaning it's the longest time you take to take a pit stop and also travel down pit road. It's around 30 seconds. This means there's very little variation in strategy because teams want to minimize going down pit road as much as possible, basically. So you'll basically one stop. The only thing that varies is the timing of that one stop, but teams, it's impossible to make a 2 stop. You're losing 60 seconds down pit road and you're not going to make that up on new tyres. And the final thing I wanted to comment on is just that the Imola circuit is so narrow. It was built with a different generation of cars. These cars are 2 meters wide, 5.7 meters long. They're just not built for it. It's like a Formula 1 car, if they park it in the middle of the road, it's just a 200-mile-an-hour road blockage. For me, Imola just is not built for modern F1 cars, and they can either make circuit changes like tightening up the Tamburello chicane, or even better, I would actually suggest they move the circuit back to its 1994 layout with keeping Acqua Minerale the same and Ravazza 1 the same, but basically getting rid of the Tamburello and Villeneuve chicane and having a chicane before the start-finish line. Instead, I think that would open up overtaking opportunities into Tosa, and with modern technology, it could be made a lot safer than what it was back in 1994. Or, of course, they could just scrap the circuit. Let's go to Malaysia or Turkey. I would much rather go to those circuits. But let me know down below in the comments if you would like to see Imola off the F1 calendar and if you would make any circuit changes to it. My final comment about the race itself has to be a bit of a rant here about TV direction being absolutely awful. I think they missed around 75% of the overtakes in this race, and given it had so little, it's just pure embarrassing at this stage for F1, especially when Perez pitted for those medium tyres and started making overtakes throughout the field. We didn't cut to him. We only saw replays of his overtakes he was making. I also dislike how it has to cut to a driver pitting. Like, I love Lewis Hamilton, but I don't need to see him pitting from 7th down to P9 with no one around him. There's no point. You can put that in a mini box on the timing tower. I would much rather see cars battling 5/10 away than looking at Lewis Hamilton pit when he's by himself. But I think that's all I have to add about TV direction. It's never been great. It's a tough job, I will admit, but I think they could do things a lot better and use the mini boxes on the screen more often. Anyway, in summary, apart from the Norris Verstappen ending we had, the race was pretty boring. I didn't really enjoy it that much, but the final 15 laps were pretty good, so I'll give it that. All right, it's my favorite time of the week. Let's talk about the top 10 finishes. Of course, you had Verstappen coming home in P1. I think he drove extremely well all weekend, given the Red Bull was nowhere near its best and they were struggling with setup issues. He looked especially bad through Acqua Minerale in FP1 and FP2. He executed perfectly at the race start to hold the lead, and he showed why he's the three-time champ because he was able to keep Norris behind when it really, really mattered. I don't know if any other drivers would have been able to hold off Lando Norris charging that hard in the same way Max Verstappen was able to do. Norris, of course, came home in P2 in also a very strong drive. And I think if his first stint was a bit better to Verstappen's comparatively, he may have been in a spot to challenge him for the race win, which is what Norris was saying. His first stint was lacking. If it was a bit better, he might have been able to challenge Verstappen, but I don't think there's much more he could have done this weekend. He executed extremely well. And so once again, another solid performance from Norris. Maybe his qualifying could have been better. He only qualified P3. He was behind Piastri, but of course he got bumped up to P2, so it was irrelevant anyway. Leclerc came home in P3, and it actually looked like he might have had the pace to challenge Norris for P2 at the beginning of the stint on those hard tyres, but either he wore his hard tyres out too much or Norris was just holding him back a bit, letting them settle in before pushing the tyres. But after he went off through Variante Alta, Norris was able to pull away. Overall though, it was a very strong performance from Leclerc. He was clearly the quicker Ferrari driver just over Carlos Sainz. And of course, Piastri was now in P4. His grid drop was what cost him finishing on the podium here. I think if he qualified P2, he's definitely getting a podium finish. I think the McLaren was just quicker on race pace than the Ferrari, but his grid drop cost him. He was, of course, able to undercut Sainz here, but he just got stuck behind both Ferraris. It's too hard to make an overtake here. The cars are too similar on race pace, so he just wasn't able to make any progress. His grid drop was completely deserved. It's not his fault. The team needs to tell him earlier, but yes, he definitely impeded K-Mag. So it was a decent weekend. He's still lacking a bit to Norris, but he's getting there. Sainz was P5 and had a solid weekend, but ultimately was just missing that pace to Leclerc by a tenth or two, but it's still a decent haul of points for Ferrari and himself, and an overall decent weekend. You then had both Mercedes coming home in P6 and P7, led by Hamilton. This is exactly where Toto Wolff predicted they would finish, and it's basically where they should have. They didn't have the pace of Verstappen, the Ferraris, and the McLarens, but they were much quicker than all the cars behind them. So it was a lonely race for both Mercedes. I will say that Russell probably should have finished ahead of Hamilton here, but the team boxed him so that they could get an extra point as a team for fastest lap, which Hamilton couldn't do because he didn't have a pit window behind him. So Russell was ultimately the faster driver this weekend, should have finished ahead, but played the team game to get Mercedes an extra point, even if it meant costing his own points tally. Russell, good weekend. Hamilton, slightly worse, even though it wasn't reflected in the results. Sergio Perez was P8 and was just comparatively slow to Verstappen. He couldn't get a handle on the Red Bull when it wasn't in its operating window, like it wasn't in this weekend. Qualifying basically sealed his fate here. You're not going to make much progress from 11th, even if you're the best driver on the grid in the best car, which arguably Sergio isn't. He ran the hards first, went really long, then switched to the mediums, and was able to overtake the likes of Ricciardo, Tsunoda, Hulkenberg, which he was fighting for originally at the beginning of the race, but he couldn't make any more progress than that. And it was just giving echoes of Perez last year, qualifying down the order and then not making much progress. So, yeah, it is what it is, though. And then, of course, Lance Stroll came home in P9 and looked like the fastest Aston driver all weekend, basically. He did a great job to look after his mediums, extend, and then was able to put on the hard tyres at the end, much fresher than the RBs and the Haas's ahead of him, and was able to overtake and get a solid points haul. Two points. It's still a solid hole considering where Fernando Alonso finished, so he should be happy with his performance. Tsunoda once again was the driver scoring that final point, not dominated by the top 5 teams, coming home in 10th. His undercut on Hulkenberg in the pit stops was really what enabled him to get this point, because I don't think he was passing Hulk if he was stuck behind him after that first stint, and he was able to use the fresh air he had to build up a big enough gap as to not get chased down by the drivers with fresh tyres behind him, so he should be happy with his performance, and he did look like the slightly faster RB driver all weekend. Alright, let's quickly talk about the bottom 10 drivers here, or the final 10 drivers, I probably shouldn't say bottom. Hulkenberg and Ricciardo were the two that came home in P11 and P13. They, alongside Tsunoda, boxed really early from their medium tyres onto the hard tyres, and that ended up costing them at the end of the race as they just didn't have the pace to hold off the cars behind. The poor start from the RBs ultimately hampered them and allowed them both to get jumped by Hulkenberg. Of course, Tsunoda was then able to undercut Hulkenberg, but it completely ruined Ricciardo's race and he couldn't use his pace in fresh air. So overall, a decent race from both drivers this weekend. Kevin Magnussen came home in 12th with a solid drive coming home from 18th, I believe. The strategy to go long on the mediums and then have fresh tyres at the end really paid dividends for him. He was able to make up spots, but ultimately just not enough to get into the points, and that's the story for a lot of these drivers that went long. Both Alpines really came home in P14 and P16, Ocon leading Gasly. They split the strategies between them with a 1-stop and a 2-stop, but ultimately both drivers just weren't quick enough. The Alpine wasn't quick enough to challenge for points this weekend, which was a bit surprising given they looked really good in free practice, but they just couldn't translate it to quali and race pace. Still, they seem to be getting quicker each weekend, and it's a similar story for the kit cars down in 15th and 18th for Zhou leading Bottas. They just weren't quick enough for points, but Zhou looked to have the slight pace edge on Bottas this weekend. Williams, of course, is next, with Sargent coming home 17th and Albon 19th after losing a wheel and then getting a penalty. This was Albon, he had a loose wheel during his pit stop. It just seems the Williams weren't quick here, as they have been at other circuits. Albon wasn't looking extremely quick as well, even before the mishaps in the pit stops that he had. Williams is just a demonstration of 1 step forward, 2 steps back at the moment, as they made the car a more balanced car this year, but it's cost them that straight line speed, which allowed them to get points last year. But it's still the right direction for them to go with. You need a balanced car if you want to challenge for victories, podiums, or championships in the end. So they made the right decision. It's just the story of that they have to sometimes go back to go further forward, and it's just the case for them. So hopefully with some more upgrades, they might be able to challenge for some points come later in the year. Finally, Fernando Alonso came home in P19, which is not a sentence I was expecting to be saying, and it was an awful weekend for him. Fernando crashed in FP3 and had a really poor qualifying and made 4 pit stops in a race, which he said Aston and him were going to treat like a test session. Stroll showed that the Aston did have pace to score points this weekend, especially in its upgraded form, but it was clear that Fernando was just off his best this weekend. Well, that about wraps up the Imola Grand Prix. Rating-wise, I'm going to have to give it a 5 out of 10 here. This race, without the ending, would have been a solid 2 out of 10, but that final 15 laps between Norris and Verstappen had me on the edge of my seat and has vaulted it up to a 5 out of 10. There was no real ability for the cars to race each other this weekend, so finger crossed it loses its spot on the F1 calendar, at least from my perspective. I know it's good historical importance, but I'd rather us go to Turkey or Malaysia instead. But saying that, next weekend we go to Monaco, where it is extremely difficult to overtake and probably won't produce better racing, but that's alright. I can accept that Monaco's on the F1 calendar. It's been on it for ages, and I'm happy to deal with one race a year where qualifying matters extremely well. Again, qualifying, as I said before, will be extremely important, and the same with executing pit stops. So I'm excited to see who can produce those laps under pressure and who won't crumble. I'm excited for Monaco. It's a one-off. That being said, let me know what you would rate the race out of 10 down below in the comments, but thank you so much all for listening, and have a great rest of your day.